He was the most deserving person ever to become president, and he may have been the most personally unsuited for the job. John Adams had a miserable presidency. It began on a gloomy March day in Philadelphia, 1797, at his inauguration.
Everybody is very moved to see the great hero George Washington leave the stage. And John Adams writes that Washington gave him a look as if to say, well, I'm leaving, now you're coming in, see if you enjoy the job.
Number 2, John Adams, Federalist, 1797 to 1801. 61 years old, from Massachusetts.
If you think about following George Washington, how does one follow a person who is the American Cincinnatus?
Oh my God, can you imagine how poor John Adams must have felt upon succeeding to the presidency, to follow this man.
He was Harvard educated, yet insecure, enormously ambitious, yet oddly humble.
Adams is a wonderful character. I mean, you've got to love him. He's erratic. One day he's up, one day he's down. I think there may have been a little imbalance there in his system. He craved fame and power, but he always pulled himself back and said, no, I must make sacrifices for my country. Some days he thought he was on top of the world, and other days he thought he was just the lowest failure on earth.
John Adams is a figure who was in many ways racked with self-doubt, at the same time enormously ambitious. Adams's personality was not suited to the presidency.
John Adams certainly had the political pedigree to be president. He was a signer of the Declaration, a member of the Continental Congress, minister to France and England, and America's first vice president. And yet, as a leader of men, John Adams' management style was problematic at best.
During his administration, Adams is heavily criticized for his pretentiousness as a man who was kingly in a way that George Washington never was.
He was a very, very opinionated man, and he was sure that he was right and did not accept counsel as well as other presidents have.
Adams was also prone to fits of anger, which he unleashed on subordinates.
This is just not the way an effective executive deals with the people under him.
2 issues defined Adams' presidency: the XYZ affair and the Alien and Sedition Acts. Both were caused by a crisis in foreign affairs, the escalating war between England and France.
By the time John Adams comes into office, the French are being particularly obnoxious. They are going through a period of seizing our shipping because they don't want us trading with her enemy, Britain.
Hoping to quell the crisis, Adams sent a diplomatic team to Paris.
That delegation was met with the demand for a bribe. This was reported back to the American Congress. Instead of referring to the Frenchmen who demanded the bribe by their correct names, they were simply referred to as X, Y, and Z. And so this became known as the XYZ affair.
American public opinion raged against the French. Hawks screamed for war.
Adams is not crazy about the French anyway. And so to be snubbed by the French like this, to be treated in effect like country bumpkins, must have offended Adams tremendously.
But instead of acting impulsively, Adams kept his cool and sent a second peace delegation to Paris. For this, the warmongers in Congress vilified him.
Adams had the courage to stand against these men. Indeed, he stood against most of the men in his own party, the Federalist Party. But he was firm and adamant in seeking a peaceful solution.
Adams would reach his peaceful solution in 1800 when France and the United States signed the Treaty of Mortefontaine. But this wouldn't happen before Adams made the worst decision of his presidency.
In the midst of our difficulties with France, there were a great many dissident voices within America. Men, newspaper editors, some politicians, who were voicing their distress with the policies of the Adams government.
Acutely sensitive to criticism, Adams decided that the verbal attacks were seditious and dangerous to national security. So, in 1798, Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, making it a crime to falsely speak out or write against certain federal office holders, including the president.
It stands out as the single greatest blemish on his otherwise extraordinary career. It fed into this image of Adams as the aristocrat, as Adams having this tinge of royalty, of arrogance. And the Alien Sedition Acts simply underscored what his enemies were already saying about this man.
Sadly, Adams' support of the Alien and Sedition Acts overshadowed the treaty with France. But the importance of his diplomacy cannot be forgotten.
It was a monumental achievement and one of those great turning points. For had we not made peace with France, had Adams succumbed to the pressure to go to war, the history of America would have been very, very different.
Significantly, the threat of war with France was the impetus for the one legacy of Adams' presidency.
John Adams is the father of the American Navy. It was Adams that understood that if America was to defend her shores, that it was necessary to have a Navy.
By creating the Department of the Navy, Adams became the first U.S. president to add a secretary to his cabinet. But even the U.S. Navy could not save John Adams from himself. He had alienated many members of Congress and men of his own party. In November 1800, just after becoming the first president to live in the White House, Adams lost his bid for a second term to Thomas Jefferson. It was a bitter defeat.
Adams is not gracious in defeat. The image we have today of the election of a new president, and the former president bids him welcome to the White House, etc., etc. Oh, no, not at all. Adams leaves Washington in the midst of the night.
When he left office, he was certainly the most unhappy man in the country because he believed he left office disgraced and unappreciated.
During his own life, John Adams' presidency was regarded as the low point of his remarkable political career. It would take nearly 200 years for historians to reassess his contribution to the office. Two presidents signed the Declaration of Independence, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Both died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the signing. The election of 1800 set two precedents in American history. It was the first election in which the press played a big role. And for the first time in presidential politics, power was peacefully shifting from one political party to another. In this highly contentious election, the founding party of the nation, the Federalists, had been defeated, and the popular leader of a new political party was moving into the White House. Number 3, Thomas Jefferson, Democratic Republican, 1801 to 1809, 58 years old, from Virginia. Thomas Jefferson was the first president inaugurated in Washington.
On the day of his inauguration, Thomas Jefferson walks to the unfinished Capitol to deliver his inaugural address. In one of the most important statements ever made by a president in any inaugural address, he tells the assembled group, "We are all Federalists. We are all Republicans."
But Jefferson did not intend to follow the Federalist model for the presidency.
Jefferson believes that his election was virtually a second revolution. He thought the government was going down a very bad path under the Federalists. He thought he'd saved it.
Jefferson believed the Federalists had put too much power in the central government. He vowed to reverse that.
Well, it's the old adage, of course, a Jeffersonian adage, that government is best which governs least, except when you're elected to office.
He was a remarkably casual man who sometimes greeted guests in his slippers. He was also eccentric and secretive. Such was the self-styled character of Thomas Jefferson.
Jefferson viewed himself and presented himself as a man of the people. Somewhat ironic, again, because here is Mr. Jefferson, who lives in perhaps the most elegant home in all of America, Monticello. He's hardly a man of the people. But on the other hand, he has this ability to connect and to make this pretense, to make this image of this Democrat with a small d.
To help spin this image, Jefferson adopted a casual tone for protocol and official behavior at the president's mansion.
It was said that if you went to the White House, quite often Mr. Jefferson himself would open the door.
Jefferson also ended the formal state dinners established by Washington and continued by Adams. Instead, he hosted informal supper parties, where guests could sit anywhere they pleased.
Even at the same time that Jefferson is symbolically downgrading the office, he is using it very effectively, and he calls the tune.
President Jefferson was a quiet but effective manager who preferred working in the privacy of his office than in the public eye.
He does not give his annual messages to Congress as speeches in person. He doesn't do that. He sends them written messages instead.
He did not like to give public addresses. He was not a good public speaker. He had a very, very soft voice, apparently.
But he was definitely a brilliant and cunning politician.
He is brilliant at using power in a way that people don't know that he's using it.
This was especially true with the press.
Jefferson handled the press very, very well. He understood the importance of the press.
The press, however, didn't always give him a free pass. In 1802, a tabloid writer of the day reported Jefferson's alleged affair with Sally Hemings, one of his slaves. Jefferson skillfully managed the scandal by doing nothing.
Thomas Jefferson never responded to any allegations, any accusations of his relationship with Sally Hemings or with anyone else. Jefferson simply ignored it.
Early spend control from a master politician. I mean, if more people could follow that prescription, people wouldn't get into the trouble that, they get into by talking too much. Jefferson never talked about anything that he didn't want to talk about.
The defining moment of Jefferson's presidency was his expansion of executive power to make the Louisiana Purchase, the mega deal of the 19th century. It more than doubled the size of the United States for a mere $15 million.
This is just a bargain. But he doesn't know whether it's constitutional for him to do this. In fact, he rather thinks it isn't.
Had he been true to his principles, he never would have done it.
Not only did he do it, but he used Alexander Hamilton's system of finance to fund it, a system he had publicly opposed for 15 years. In effect, Jefferson did a complete political 180. Because of this, the Federalists attacked him.
They hammer him with this. The argument is, you are the one who's been worried about the federal government doing too much and taking on too much power. Well, here you've grabbed a third of the continent and you're proposing to rule it by military governors. Doesn't that look like big government to you?
Ignoring his critics, Jefferson also authorized a secret exploration of the territory, the Lewis and Clark Expedition. It would eventually be regarded as an epic American adventure. But when Jefferson sent a secret message to Congress requesting money for the mission, his enemies screamed that it was an unconstitutional military foray.
So Jefferson, the man who supposedly loved small government, is a president who dramatically expands the power of the federal government. That, of course, is a tradition in our presidency.
In 1804, Thomas Jefferson was overwhelmingly re-elected. Yet he found little joy during his second term.
Jefferson is a very sensitive man. He hates the criticism that he gets. And his second term becomes hell to him. He feels as if he's in prison.
I think Jefferson's greatest shortcoming in office was his inability to deal with the rising international crisis.
That crisis was the escalating war between England and France.
Jefferson believed that America need not be involved with Europe, that somehow it was possible for us to ignore the world beyond us and to deal only with an interior America.
The problem was American merchants were trading with England and France. That infuriated both sides. Acting impulsively, Jefferson issued the Embargo Act of 1807, stopping all trade with all foreign nations.
What a foolish solution to a problem. Doesn't want to go to war with France, doesn't want to go to war with England. And so instead of making a decision, he says, okay, we're not going to trade with anybody. Well, this is not a statesmanlike decision, and it's disastrous for New England trade.
The Embargo Act of 1807 was extremely controversial, and it really sank his second term.
By 1808, Thomas Jefferson was tormented by migraine headaches. The presidency had aged him considerably. Jefferson came to hate the presidency so much that he left it off his gravestone. Yet his achievements remain unparalleled in American history. He took the oath of office intending to change the power of the presidency. And indeed, he did. Thomas Jefferson kept 2 bear cubs at the White House. They were given to him by Lewis and Clark and housed in cages on the South Lawn.
Jefferson is succeeded by one of his own. The president who follows him is his Secretary of State, his friend, his associate, really his right-hand man for over 20 years.
Number 4, James Madison, Democratic Republican, 1809 to 1817, age 57, from Virginia. He was eminently qualified for the job. A veteran of the Revolution, author of the Constitution, a Jeffersonian Democrat, and a Virginian.
There are people who feel that he had a much, in some ways, a better mind than Jefferson, certainly a more disciplined mind than Jefferson.
In truth, James Madison was everything Thomas Jefferson wasn't.
He was sort of the opposite of Jefferson physically. He was short, while Jefferson was tall. He was funnier than Jefferson. He was known as having a bawdy sense of humor.
He had light hair turned gray, blue eyes, was soft-spoken, and not given to rage or small talk. He usually dressed in black. Madison brought something else to the White House that had been missing during Jefferson's presidency: a first lady.
Dolly Madison is enormously important in the shaping of protocol. She is a younger, vivacious woman who sparkles, sort of brightens up what is considered Madison's drab exterior. He becomes a much more interesting, exciting figure because of her.
The Madisons became known for lavish parties and sumptuous feasts at the White House. These often included ice cream, a delicacy of the day. Dolly's favorite flavor was oyster. As an executive, Madison had an abiding sense of fairness, a calm demeanor, and was always well prepared.
This was not only a very smart man, this was a man who did his homework, who did his thinking, who did his studying, and was really prepared for whatever came up.
Except for a war, the War of 1812, which ultimately defined his presidency.
Madison comes into office with an enormous problem on his hands. Half the country's still pushing to go to war with England, half the country's pushing to go to war with France. And Madison is really pushed by events into the war. with England.
The War of 1812 was sparked on the high seas. Shortly after Madison's inauguration, the British began seizing American ships and impressing U.S. sailors and merchant seamen. Diplomatic efforts to solve the crisis went nowhere. Finally, on June 18, 1812, James Madison became the first president in U.S. history to ask Congress for a declaration of war.
Imagine what chutzpah it took. We declared war on Great Britain. They did not declare war on us. Our Navy in 1812 numbered about 20 ships. Theirs numbered about 1,000. Their army was battling Napoleon and was triumphant. We had barely a militia. It was a foolish thing to do.
It is a disaster. We lose humiliating engagements in Detroit and in upstate New York, and the war begins very badly indeed.
Madison's troubles grew as the war progressed, especially in New England.
There was almost a civil war in 1814 because New England threatens to secede. I mean, New England is so angry, their lifeblood is commerce and shipping.
Then, in August 1814, the British raided Washington and burned the president's mansion. Driven from his home, James Madison became the first and only sitting president to face enemy fire. He personally took command of a militia battery outside Washington, but to his embarrassment, the commander-in-chief was forced to retreat.
Much as we hate to disappoint the American public who believes America has never lost a war, we definitely lost this war. Our capital was burned. We're defeated on land, on sea. And poor Madison is burdened with this image that he got us into the war.
Desperate to end it, Madison sent James Monroe to negotiate peace with England. In December 1814, Monroe succeeded with the Treaty of Ghent, officially ending the war. Then, before news of the treaty reached Washington, America was strangely rewarded with a belated victory at the Battle of New Orleans. The man who benefited most was the defender of New Orleans, General Andrew Jackson. But the victory did little for James Madison.
Two important things come out of this war. Dolly Madison saves the portrait of George Washington and the Star-Spangled Banner. But it does tarnish Madison. It's about the only thing he's really remembered for.
The War of 1812 brought the American presidency into the politics of international diplomacy and the real world. Foreign issues could no longer be ignored.
This is a rude awakening about world politics that Madison gets with the War of 1812. It's a time of the opening up of the presidency, the part of America becoming much more mature. And the president has to play a role in this because he is the symbol of the United States.
As with those who came before him and those who would follow, James Madison learned a harsh lesson about the office he helped create. It is not so much about the man, but the unforeseen events which define a presidency. Before the War of 1812, James Madison proposed that the United States, instead of building new ships, should simply rent Portugal's navy. It didn't happen.